I was never really good pals with Andy. He was everywhere, but he had a kind of pernicious effect on friends. We kind of lose them for a while. They get sucked into Andy's world.
And they disappear.
And yeah, it's like, and then all of a sudden you'd hang out with them and they'd be, you know, busy because they were talking to Andy. You know,
right.
I was his biggest admirer that way. It's funny in New York, you inherit these generations of people who kind of also passed through Warhol. So it's like, as I said, the day before I came out here, I happened to be spending time with Glenn O'Brien. You know, I was deeply informed by him. And then just looking at this show, I realized, like, oh yeah, you know, part of my life is running into someone like Gerard Malenga and hearing him kvetch like the old grumpy Jew he is about the way his life is. Warhol still exerts a curious presence in New York because of all the people whose history is inextricably wound up with it. Or whatever. The other night I had dinner with Michel Adair. He's not really part of Warhol's world, but he was, you know, married and had children, being a superstar. Right. So you know, in the New York cultural community of a certain age group, it's hard to find even a degree of separation. And that was one of the big losses. I mean, New York clubs really took a spiritual dive after Andy's passing because they kind of needed him to kind of come on in with like some famous person and to validate the club and part of that history. And then when he was gone, the impetus for doing that wasn't there. So the clubs got bigger and less interesting. And I don't think that's just me being older and saying I'm not going to go to clubs anymore, which is always a factor when people start talking about the degeneration of the nightlife scene. It's usually about them getting older. But there was something really missing there.
So, if I just mention Bob Broder, quick reaction.
To this work, it's kind of stunningly original because he comes at like this incredibly mediated figure. If you look at it in the context of the rest of all this Warhol photography, all these photographs of Andy and his milieu, you get people who really care about the privilege of that access, and they, you know, they're really, oh, there's Andy in the club, or there's in the factory, and it's done with a lot of care. Bob's sort of like coming with a less, probably less, you know, less of an agenda. It's sort of like, oh, okay, here's a bunch of freaks from New York are shooting this thing here, and you know, and so it's a more direct thing. It's nice to see how it would look. It's kind of more original that way. Sure. Andy, who's been, you know, obviously been around as an iconic figure now for a while, there's been times where kids really care about him and times when they don't. And right now it seems that kids find this stuff really fresh and really interesting. So one of the things I was thinking is that after, you know, we've now gone through like 3 generations, we've endured baby boomer nostalgia. For some reason, you know, that huge baby boom, those people really thought that their youth was so much more definitive than anyone else's. You know, it's like if you didn't see Hendrix play, or you didn't, you know, if you weren't at Woodstock, or you know, it's like they over-dominated. They basically took over from the, you know, the greatest generation, and they've kind of been running American cultural discourse now for a little too long. So everyone has to inherit like this idea of that stuff, and this is a really good antidote to it because it is a lot darker and a lot weirder and a lot gayer and a lot, you know, just it's just more transgressive than the kind of idealized notion of what hippiedom was. And there were these currents that, you know, if you talk to old people in San Francisco, they hated when the hippies took over because originally it was kind of the freaks, and the freaks, you know, had a much richer, more ambivalent, you know, more complex relationship with dominant culture. They were a lot angrier about it. They weren't just kind of like dropping out and holding hands and smelling incense and stuff like that. So that kind of idea got silenced until, you know, tendencies within the 60s. And if you look at like what the Exploding Plastic Inevitable was, what the Velvet Underground were doing, what, you know, the Speed Freaks and the Factory were up to, it's like, you know, it's a much darker, more shadowed more chiaroscuro idea of like what was behind that idealism as well.